you all. It's great to be back in South Carolina. So the topic of this talk revolves around a Roman emperor who is not so well known. When I bring up the name of Emperor Julian, people often ask if I'm referring to Julius Caesar. And no, I'm not. That's a different emperor. And they were different in personality. They lived in different time periods. Two completely different emperors. And Emperor Julian, although his reign as sole emperor was quite short, we're talking about a bit under 3 years, not very long for Roman emperors, he managed to do quite a lot in that time. And he had a very interesting personality and set of experiences. And the connection between him and Jerusalem is what leads to this topic of Jewish pagan interfaith matters. I thought this is the ideal historical character to start with to examine Jewish pagan relations. So what I'll do is give a bit of background on Jerusalem itself leading up to Julian's time. Then I'll go back to Julian and his background connected. So in Judaism, there has only been one place where there was a temple. Unlike some religious traditions where you have a multitude of temples in various cities, sometimes multiple temples within a city, in Judaism, the temple has always been in one place on the Temple Mount in the old city of Jerusalem. That is, since the time it was built. Before it was built, there was, of course, a tabernacle which moved from place to place, first throughout the Sinai Desert, and then various other places in the land of Israel as described in the Old Testament. Now, the first temple was built by King Solomon, and we're talking between 2,900, 3,000 years ago. And the choice of location is very important because in Jewish tradition, the place of the temple is held to be the place where the binding of Isaac took place, and it's also held to be the place where the creation of the world began. So it's literally the center of the universe in terms of Jewish thought. And that first temple, built by Solomon, stood there until the year 586, before the Common Era, when it was destroyed by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar. And this is described in the book of Jeremiah, it's described in the book of Kings. Also described in Chronicles, I think. Yeah. So the destruction of the first temple was accompanied by an exile of most of the Jewish population to Babylon. And it was after Babylon was taken over by the Persians that the Persian king Koresh gave a declaration granting Jews permission to return to Jerusalem and to rebuild the temple. This declaration is found at the tail end of the second book of Chronicles. And so the second temple started its building process during the Persian period on the exact same spot, the Temple Mount, where the first temple had stood. And the second temple stood there throughout the Persian period, into the Greek period, into the early Roman period. Now, in the early Roman period, there was a king by the name of Herod. He's quite famous. This king was a mix of things. He always had large architectural projects. So he's responsible for expanding the Temple Mount to make it the largest temple that was in the Roman Empire at the time. He also is responsible for Masada, and I imagine some of you may have seen that site. He also built an artificial port in Caesarea, which was quite a feat. It had to use cutting-edge technology of the time involving a special type of cement that would solidify underwater. Okay? So he always thought big in terms of his building projects. Besides that, he was constantly paranoid. He thought everyone was trying to kill him. And after he killed a bunch of people, then probably everyone else was trying to kill him. That's a fair guess. Anyway, he expanded the Temple Mount, right? And so the end of the Second Temple period, the temple's a lot bigger than it was before, but it's still on the Temple Mount. Now, at the end of the Second Temple period, we're talking about increased friction with Rome. And there was a rebellion against Rome, during which the Roman general Titus came into Jerusalem and destroyed the temple. Now, interestingly, on the Jewish calendar, it's the same calendar date. Even though it's hundreds of years apart, the date on which the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the first temple is exactly the same calendar date on the Jewish calendar as the date when Titus destroyed the second temple. That date is the 9th of the month of Av, and that is the saddest day on the Jewish calendar. To this day, it is observed as a 24-hour fast, and the liturgy on that day is quite mournful, and that's understandable under the circumstances. Now, the Romans figured that once they had smashed the rebellion against Rome, that would be that. Because the general pattern in Rome was, you get a bit of resistance from the locals, you bring in the legions, you show them who's boss, and now you're part of the Roman Empire, and that's it. Well, not so in Judea. A generation later, there was a second revolt against Rome. And there was a very able military commander by the name of Bar Kokhba, who managed to keep the Romans at bay for a few years, which is a staggering feat considering how powerful the empire was by that point. However, the Romans kept bringing in more and more reinforcements, and eventually they were able to defeat that second rebellion. Now, when that happened, the emperor at the time, Emperor Hadrian, and we're talking about the year 135, 136, Emperor Hadrian said, we can't have a third revolt against Rome. That is unacceptable. And so he took certain measures to prevent that from happening. Among them, he declared that the city of Jerusalem would now be renamed Ilia Capitolina in honor of the Roman god Jupiter. And he went so far as to build a temple unto Jupiter on the Temple Mount, to say, this is no longer a Jewish place, this is now Roman. In addition, he made a provision that Jews were not allowed, on pain of death, into the city of Jerusalem. Very severe. In addition, he placed a special tax. He placed a special tax on Jews. It's known as the Fiscus Judaicus, and it was basically to impoverish the local Jewish community, because he figured if they don't have the resources for another revolt, then that will make it much harder for them to put one together. And so this is the setup as of the 2nd century, a situation that pretty much persisted, by the way, until the arrival of the Arabs in the 7th century. It was only with the arrival of Omar ibn al-Khattab that Jews were allowed back into Jerusalem. And so the fact that at Jaffa Gate there's a square named for Omar, it's very fitting, because he really changed things in that regard. Okay, so this is what was going on as of the 2nd century. Now that's a bit earlier than Julian's time. So let me jump back to Julian now. Okay? So, in terms of the Roman policy towards Christians, in the time of the Emperor Nero, after the Great Fire in the year 64, there was a very active policy of persecution of Christians by the Roman Empire. And the way that the Romans looked at concept of religion, they held that things which were ancient were to be respected. And since they knew that the Jews had been around for a long time, they recognized that even though Jewish observance was kind of weird from a Roman standpoint, I mean, you have Roman writers saying, these people worship the air. Where are their gods? They worship the air, right? And their refusal to participate in the ceremonies of worship of the emperor and so on. Well, in some cases, they actually got exemptions for this on the basis of antiquity. So there was a certain amount of respect along those lines. Obviously, when there was political friction, that was a different story, as seen during the time of Emperor Hadrian. But Christianity was something new. And the Romans didn't like new things in the realm of religion. And so there was a very anti-Christian policy starting during the reign of Nero. And when we were Constantine lived from 272 to 337. And Constantine got very interested in Christianity. And there's a well-known story about a vision that he had before a major battle with the words in Latin, in hoc signe, by this sign, you will be victorious. And it was the sign of the cross. And he was victorious, and he said, oh, there's something to this Christianity thing. And he was actually very cautious not to take baptism until close to death, because he wasn't quite sure how this thing worked. If he were to take baptism and then sin afterwards, what would happen? He wasn't really sure. So he decided to play it safe and get baptism just before death, just to keep things covered, Now, under Constantine, the policy towards Christianity softened, obviously, because it was favored by the emperor. Now, Christianity was not an official religion of the Roman Empire at that point, but Constantine made it more acceptable. Okay, the technical term that's used, religio licita, a legal religion. Okay, so basically you could say that during Constantine's time, Christianity was legalized in the Roman Empire. It wasn't official yet, but it was legalized. And after the death of Constantine, there was a lot of confusion because Constantine was a major central figure, and his successors were not as powerful or charismatic as he was. And so there was a situation where, for a while, there were combinations of 2 or 3 different people who served as emperor at the same time, kind of trying to patch things together until there was another really strong figure. And so Julian came into the picture during that time. He was sole emperor from 331 to, he was born in 331-32, lived to 363, and his reign as sole emperor was between 361 and 363. Okay, so we're talking about a bit under 3 years. It's not really such a long time as an emperor, but he actually accomplished quite a bit during that time. Now, if we look at Julian's background, in his early years, he received education in a Christian context, so he was familiar with Christianity in that time and place. And when you get to about the year 351, he started studying Neoplatonic philosophy under a philosopher by the name of Idesius, who was a student of the Neoplatonic philosopher Iamblichus. Now, I imagine this is a topic that's not so familiar in general, so perhaps I'll take a couple of minutes to clarify. We do. Okay. Oh, excellent. In general, for those who aren't familiar, you have 3 major figures in the early period of Greek philosophy. Socrates, I think everyone's heard of. And then his student, Plato, was the one who wrote down the thought, as well as writing down his own writings. Socrates never wrote anything down. He had all kinds of reasons for that. So we know about Socrates primarily from Plato's writings, most of which are a series of dialogues, and Socrates stars in many of them. And then Plato's student was Aristotle. And while Aristotle was a student of Plato, he had some differences of opinion with his teacher. And in the realm of Greek philosophy, we can really talk about a divide between people who sided with Plato and people who sided with Aristotle. And actually, I have a neighbor in Beersheba who's very heavy into philosophy. And the first time we met, he looks at me and he says, Plato or Aristotle? I want to know where we stand. Okay? Now, both of these philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, established schools of philosophy. And so in addition to the founders of these schools, you have their various students over the generations, Aristotelian philosophers and Platonic philosophers. And what happens in the realm of Platonic philosophers is that at a later point, there are some new trends among the students of Plato. And this is where we're talking about this concept of Neo-Platonic, right? The same way that you have your classic Confucian philosophy, and then you talk about Neo-Confucians at a later point in time. You always have these Neo things at a later point because you can't really recreate entirely what the original thing was because the times have changed and people are reinterpreting the text, right? And so the big figures in terms of Neoplatonic philosophy, you have someone by the name of Plotinus in the 3rd century from about 204-5 until 270. Then you have his student Porphyry, 234 to 305. And then Iamblichus comes in, 245 to 325. And so the teacher who taught philosophy to Emperor Julian was a student of this third major figure in Neoplatonic philosophy. And it's worth mentioning, I'm not going to go into a whole thing about the teachings of Neoplatonic philosophy. That will be a separate talk. If there's interest, maybe next time we can go into that in detail. But one thing I do want to stress is that in Neoplatonic philosophy, although this was taking place in a pagan context, there was recognition within this system that when speaking about the divine, there is a oneness that is above all of these things. So while it wasn't monotheism per se, there is a notion of oneness at a higher level within this system of philosophy. And that's very significant, particularly if you're having a conversation with someone who believes in one God, right? So someone coming from a Neoplatonic standpoint would say, all right, there are other gods, of course, but I recognize this oneness you speak of, so we have a bit of common ground there. And so this clearly influenced Julian's thought very significantly. And so as we continue with how his life unfolded, in 355, he became Caesar in the West. Right? Not the whole Roman Empire, just the West. And he had some battles in Germany and so on in the 350s. And then it's 361 that he becomes sole ruler of the Roman Empire. And once this happens, he starts right away going into his idea of how he wants the empire managed. Okay? And so one of the things he did, in 362, he put out an edict of freedom of religion. And this is a very significant thing. This was linked with the reopening of pagan temples that had been confiscated, okay? And it also involved the return from exile of various dissident Christian bishops. Now, from a political standpoint, you could say what he was doing was trying to make sure that Christianity didn't gain too much additional influence, because there was a reason these guys were exiled. They presented alternate pictures of Christianity, and with them out of the way, it would be easier to consolidate one particular direction. But if you bring them back, now there's all kinds of competition. And so it was in his interest, because he was promoting paganism, he was not promoting Christianity. And so by giving this edict of freedom of religion and extending it across the board, that actually was to his advantage from a political standpoint. And within this, he also brought in the matter of what about the Jewish community? And as we know from earlier in the talk, Emperor Hadrian had placed quite a few hardships on the Jewish community in the land of Israel. Well, Julian's idea was to remove these obstacles, and he actually wrote a letter to the Jewish patriarch in the Holy Land saying, in the old days, we pagans had temples in Rome, and you had a temple in Jerusalem. Now both of these are in ruins. Let's do something about that. Let's rebuild our temples in Rome and your temple in Jerusalem, and I'll give you imperial backing and support for this project. Now, you can imagine the exhilaration when that letter arrived, and he also made a point of removing the other obstacles. I mean, you couldn't rebuild a Jewish temple in Jerusalem if Jews weren't allowed inside the city. So he got rid of that restriction, and he also abolished that special tax on Jews. In other words, he reversed many of the things that Hadrian had done. However, the one really sad thing is that he did this just before he went to battle with the Persians, and unfortunately died in battle. And this meant that while there was an enormous potential for something really new and exciting to happen in Jerusalem, the moment he was dead, his successors said, okay, forget all you heard from this guy. He was an aberration. We're now going back to the normal stuff. We're going back to the regular policies. And in history books, you will typically see him described as Julian the Apostate. Because, he was bucking the trend. He was going in a different direction than the emperors before him and after him. And once he was out of the picture, they just kind of steered it back to what it was before he became emperor. And so the potential was there, but it wasn't actualized beyond an initial glimmer of hope. And there is an interesting inscription that was found on the Western Wall in Jerusalem. The Western Wall is one of the 4 supporting walls that King Herod built around the Temple Mount, because in order to extend the surface area of the Temple Mount, he had to change the shape of the mountain. Literally, he had to change the shape of the mountain. And in order to do this, he had to have supporting walls so the whole thing wouldn't collapse. And the supporting wall which survived best to this day is the Western Wall. And if you look very carefully up and down the Western Wall, scanning it to the length of what is uncovered now, there is one place where you can see words in Hebrew etched into the stone. And the inscription there reads, Uri'item besas libchem ve'atzmotam kadeshet. This is a very slight paraphrase of Isaiah 66, verse 14. Uri'item besas libchem ve'atzmotechem kadeshet tifrachna. James as, and when ye see this, your heart shall rejoice, and your bones shall flourish like an herb. This is within the prophecies of Isaiah, speaking words of comfort to the people about a future situation in which things would turn around for the better. Messianic era, if you will. And it is theorized that this inscription on the Western Wall was etched into the stone when there was a glimmer of hope in the time of Emperor Julian. Because people could see the potential for it, and if this emperor had only lived a few more years, well, you understand where this is going. So, another thing that this connects with in a rather interesting way, the letter in question that he wrote to the Jewish patriarch it exists in a Syriac translation. And Syriac is a dialect of Aramaic, which was historically spoken primarily by Christians in the Middle East. There are still some Christian speakers of Syriac in the Middle East, and some who have moved to Europe and North America. Actually, their Aramaic is not so far off from our Babylonian Aramaic. So on the basis of Talmud study, I was able to tune in to a Swedish radio station that had broadcasts in modern Christian Syriac Aramaic and follow more or less what they were talking about. That's really cool. That they have such programs, okay, and you can get some of them online. It's really something. Anyway, so the letter is translated into Syriac and dated. And the cool part is, when you compare the date with the Jewish calendar, it just happens to come out on the date of Lag BaOmer. Lag BaOmer occurs in the middle of a period between Pesach and Shavuot, and there are certain signs of mourning observed traditionally between Pesach and Shavuot during this Omer period, but the 33rd day of the Omer is a day of celebration. And no one's quite sure exactly why, exactly what the celebration is about. It is possible that one of the elements that caused this to be a day of celebration is that it's the very day on which the emperor's letter was dated, in which the emperor said, "I'm giving imperial backing for the rebuilding of the temple." And that's certainly a good reason to celebrate. They should have added a few more prayers on behalf of the emperor's safety. That would have been a good idea. But, too late now. I thought I should also mention that as far as Julian's writings, several of them survive in Greek. Some letters that he wrote, as well as some texts that he composed. So they offer us a glimpse into his view of paganism, which in itself is an interesting thing to study. There's a partial text which gives us an idea of how he viewed Christianity, theologically speaking. And here's a curiosity. One of the other texts that he wrote is titled Misopogon, which means the beard hater. He criticized the people of Antioch for not respecting him because he had a beard. So he gets some extra points in my assessment, recognizing that he was definitely pro-beard. Okay? This is important to remember. Okay. So that's the rough outline. How are we doing with time, by the way? Sun hasn't come up yet. 7:30. Okay. And we were scheduled till? Okay. So maybe now's a good time for some questions. Yes. Yeah. Well, from what I've seen of his writings, it's very clear to me that he was a philosopher at heart. And had there not been affairs of state that he had to tend to, I'm sure he would have preferred to stay in a library. You can see from the style of his writing that he looked into things in depth. He was very analytical. And, I mean, in some ways, the fact that he had the opportunity to be emperor fit nicely with his interest in trying to revive some elements of paganism that had been stamped out by his predecessors. So I think that's probably one of the things that convinced him, yes, he should become emperor, because he clearly had some things that he wanted to accomplish, even though for his starting point, I think, yes, he was basically mainly looking at things from a philosophical standpoint. Yes? Where did that come from? Yeah, that's a very good question. From a political standpoint, again, I think that that can be described in terms of the balance of power, because he was well aware that there were sources of theological friction between Judaism and Christianity. And one of the challenges theologically for some Christian leaders at the time was the fact that Jews had not simply converted to Christianity, the fact that Jews were still around, and were a reminder that this previous system was still running. And so for him to provide backing for the Jewish community was another way for him to ensure that Christianity did not become too powerful during his reign. So I think that's one of his calculations. But I would say that it would be cynical to attribute it solely to that, because when you look at what he writes from a Neoplatonic standpoint, I think he did connect with the idea that even though the Jews did not acknowledge other people's gods, this notion of oneness that they worshipped clicked with the higher level oneness in his own philosophical understanding. So I think that there was common theological ground, and that was an additional factor in why he wanted to provide this backing for the rebuilding of the Jewish temple. No, it came as a surprise. It really came as a surprise, and that's what makes it so wild. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Well, okay, that's a good question. From the time of Nero onwards, Christians were persecuted by the Roman Empire. And what Julian noticed is that the more the Christians were persecuted, the more popular they became. And so he said, this has to stop. We have to find a way to neutralize this, because the way that Christianity was structured, if you persecute them, then from their own understanding, they view this in higher spiritual terms, and it actually strengthens them in a way. And that's very difficult when you're trying to stamp out a phenomenon in your empire, and you find that all the measures you're taking are only making it worse, right? But this has to be coupled with the fact that Julian chose to side on the pagan side, because as long as the Roman emperors in question were interested in Christianity, they had no reason to try to quell anything. But because of Julian's very mixed educational background, that he had studied in a Christian context, he'd also studied in Neoplatonic context, he had had some time to think about things, and he came to a conclusion that he wanted to promote paganism rather than Christianity. And so then, that being the case, he said, this persecution thing is not working. How about if we give religious freedom to everybody? Now they're not persecuted, so that that element's going to be missing. And other measures that he took, rebuilding pagan temples, turning to the Jews and saying, let's rebuild your temple. He also had an educational policy where he wanted more control over the educational materials. And he said, the teachers need the stamp of approval from me in terms of what they're teaching. He was aware that education is a major way of influencing the way people approach things. And so it's very clear he gave these matters a great deal of thought. Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. Hmm. Right. True. Right. Well, there's another thread in his thought which is Hellenistic, and if you go back to the time of Aristotle, a very famous student of Aristotle was a fellow named Alexander. Maybe you've heard of him. Alexander the Great. Yeah, Alexander of Macedon. Yeah. He was actually, his father, Philip, hired Aristotle to be a private tutor for his son, who happened to take over half the world afterwards. And so in the organization of the empire of Alexander the Great, there were Hellenistic ideas in Aristotle's teaching, and that was already trying to create some common ground culturally. And in the realm of general ideas, everyone in the empire, even if their local cults and practices and ceremonies were different. And I get the impression that Julian was going for something similar, where it's not just that he wanted to have this general sort of toleration in the empire, but also to push along this idea of having a shared culture for the empire, and certain things in the realm of ideas that would be across the board among all these different groups. So I hope that partially answers the question. Yes. That is more Republican, yes. The projects that Julian was into were much more the large public temples, rather than the home-based shrines. You know, I don't know to what extent that still held sway. Not sure. Yes. Yes. They were basically confiscated properties. Right. You know, that's a very good question. I wonder if anyone did a survey on that. I'm not sure. I see. In other words, you're wondering about structurally how much of a change was involved. I don't really know. I will say this. When I described earlier in Jerusalem how in Hadrian's time he had a temple built unto Jupiter on the Temple Mount, well, I didn't mention at the time what happened when Rome went in the Christian direction. The result was not that it became a church. Rather, they simply demolished the temple of Jupiter on the Temple Mount, so all there was up there was ruins, and instead they engaged in building projects elsewhere in the Old City, centering especially around the site of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is still a very central Christian site in the Old City. And it wasn't really until the Muslim period that the Temple Mount again became used for religious purposes. First, the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the southern side of the Temple Mount, and then later a ruler by the name of Abd al-Malik who built a dome over the site where he was told Solomon had built his place of prayer. So the two domes up there, only one of them is actually a mosque. The other one was simply built in honor of King Solomon. So it is interesting how in some times and places you have a shift from a pagan site to a church, and other times and places where it simply lies in ruins and a church is built in some other location. This is why I'm being very cautious in response to your question, because I haven't done a survey of that in terms of Rome. Well, a political move against the Christians in the sense that strengthening of pagan activities in the Roman Empire, of course, would alter the balance of power, right? To what extent would Julian have been successful in getting the Romans at large involved in paganism? That's one of those theoretical questions that we can debate. Since he fell in battle when he was going against the Persians, we really don't know what would have happened, what might have happened. But we have an inkling of what it is he was going for, both based on what he wrote, what people wrote about him, and so on. Yes. 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 That's a fascinating question. As far as I know, the focus was about strengthening the Jewish community there, and especially since the Jewish community had been restricted and not allowed entry to Jerusalem, and so this was directly opposite to the policies that were held by his predecessors. So he was making some big changes in terms of the dynamics of the city. To what extent did he have in mind a wider sort of thing in terms of different religious traditions? It's not entirely clear, although he was well acquainted with Jewish thought at a basic level, and the differences between Jewish scripture and Christian. So I would imagine he had an inkling that attempting to have pagan centers of worship in Jerusalem would have caused friction with the Jewish community there. But the fact is, if they have one center at which they worship and he has the whole rest of the empire, it's not such a big deal. Yes? Okay, so first of all, I should point out that in terms of the letters, some of them survive in Greek, and some of them survive in different translations. And this is the sort of thing where if one starts poking around in archives that are in Syriac or classical Armenian, or there may be things that survive in other translations that we're not even aware of. A lot has not been studied in terms of things that were preserved indirectly. But as far as things beyond his own writings, there are Roman historians who wrote about it. And there are various Christian clerics who also make reference to Julian's policies. One of the things that's written about, for example, is this notion that when he made this offer to the Jewish community. You have some Christian writers saying that the Jews started walking around the place like they owned it or something, and that there were initial attempts to start the rebuilding of the temple, but there was this big earthquake. And Christian writers take this as a sign that this was not meant to be. But obviously the more significant thing is the death of the emperor, because that really silenced the whole thing. So yeah, you have a variety of sources that you can look at beyond his own writings in the comments of various Roman historians and in certain church documents of certain churches. Those are the main sources, I would say. Yes. Right. 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 I mean, this is certainly a logical approach. Judaism really stood out within the Roman Empire in terms of this, because it was really the one group that did not take in other people's gods, right? Because when you have a system that allows for multiple gods, then you have the possibility of either saying, all right, well, we'll include ritual as well. What's characteristics of your gods and our gods? And if we find that there are several characteristics in common, well, perhaps we're really talking about the same entities. And so there are a lot of examples within the Roman Empire where a local divinity in Gaul or in Germany or, Etruscan gods and so on, and they'll say, well, these are pretty much the same features, so maybe we're just talking about the same god by a different name. And this was very, very common. But as I say, the Jews were an anomaly in that. So I'm not aware of any other group that was in a similar position to that of the Jews. And when he expressed support for paganism in general, I mean, this would have applied to a wide range of pagan groups. And it's interesting that he did bring back these exiled bishops who were not pagan, but they had non-standard views theologically in a Christian context. So that's pretty much the data we have to work with. Beyond that, I think we're theorizing, which can be interesting. Yes? Yes? Right. Yes. Yes. Hmm. Hmm. Aha. Interesting. Well, first of all, as far as the etymology of the word, that is my understanding of the origin of pagan as well. And there is a difference when you look at descriptions of Roman and Greek styles of worship between the more localized and family-oriented and village-oriented rituals and ceremonies, as opposed to the larger city, large temple, focus on a particular divinity kind of thing. So I suppose one can also fine-tune what exactly are we talking about when we say pagan, because it can mean a variety of things in different contexts. What would the implications be? That's very curious. In terms of the emperor as an emperor, obviously he didn't want unrest. He didn't want revolt. And if people are going about their business with the forms of worship that they have, as long as they're paying their taxes, the empire is pretty much happy. Yeah, that's really the key, because the Romans were really into taxes. You know this, right? Yes. Well, okay. Well, that I can tell you that would have appealed to many Roman emperors, right? Because if they can find a new way of taxing, that looks very appealing to the empire. Absolutely. Right. 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 That doesn't sound like too much of a stretch from what I've seen of his writings. Yes. 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 Yeah. That is a very puzzling thing. What can I say? There are various examples I have encountered, both in the ancient world and in the Middle Ages, where people embarked on study and they were really, really focused in what they were doing. And I think that something that we have very much lost in the modern world is that ability to focus, because there are these constant distractions and beeps coming from, smartphones and things, and so right, they didn't have any smartphones then. That's part of the answer. I actually think it's a big part of the answer, because the way that they went about studying things, and they knew that life was short. They were well aware of that. And they said, okay, this is important stuff. I'm going to focus on it and go as deep as I possibly can. Even so, it's really quite stunning what some people were able to accomplish in such a short time. So, your question remains an intriguing one, even as I attempt to give a partial answer. Yes. Yes. Right. 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 Yes. Oh, it had more than that. Actually, the Library of Alexandria, they had a neat policy. Policy was anyone coming through the city had his bags examined, and if he was carrying books, they took them straight to the library, to the copying room, so that they would get a copy of any book that passed through the city. Yes, well, that's the funny thing. That's the funny thing. It's said that their scribes were so talented that the owners couldn't tell that they were receiving the copy. Yes, that may be. Well, you know, unfortunately, I wasn't able to get there in time. It was burned down. Otherwise, I would have loved to sit there reading. Yes. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Yes. That's true. That's true. Yeah. You had a question here and a question here, right? Okay. Yes. I'm not aware of anyone who picked up on that trail, but I have to say I haven't specifically looked in later Neoplatonic writings to see if there might be some threads of it. That would actually make a really good doctoral dissertation. Yes. I remember reading something about his tomb, and that after his initial burial, his body was exhumed, according to writings, and he was reinterred next to his predecessors, which tells me that he definitely was not cremated, for example, because there was a body. Beyond that, I'm not aware of the specifics of what the ceremony was. And I also know that the place that he was moved to was later destroyed. I think it was in the Ottoman period, so unfortunately there isn't a site to visit now. Where? It was in Asia Minor. Let me see. Yes, it was in Tarsus. It was in Tarsus that he was moved to. Yes. Hmm? Yeah. Okay. Yes. Okay. Good question. So first of all, in terms of the policies in the land of Israel, things reverted to what they were before Julian came on the scene, which meant Jews are not allowed in Jerusalem. The anti-Jewish tax is back, and of course, well, by the time that you're dealing with the emperors after Julian, the temple which had once stood on Temple Mount unto Jupiter was no longer in existence. It was a pile of rubble, and actually, it's very striking if you go through Jerusalem's old city, and you walk through the area where the Roman Cardo was during the Byzantine period. There's a mosaic on the wall, which is a replica of a larger mosaic that is to be found on the floor of a church, Jordan, Greek Orthodox church, that has an entire map of the Holy Land with the names of cities and indications of where certain important buildings are. And so they have a replica on the wall of the Cardo in the old city of Jerusalem of the section of that map that was Jerusalem during the Byzantine period. And what really stands out in that map is that the Temple Mount is absent. You have a depiction of Jerusalem, and there's no Temple Mount on the map, because it was not of interest to the people who made that map. It shows you where all sorts of churches are, but there's no temple map. And so as far as the policies which Hadrian had originally put into effect, they pretty much went back to what they were and remained so until the 7th century. Right. So with regard to paganism, things were also rolled back to what they were before Julian's time, which meant that the people connected with pagan temples in Rome had only a very brief window of hope. And then after that, the following emperors, who all pushed in a very strong Christian direction, shut these things down. Also, there was a consolidation of Christian focus and theology after the time of Julian, so that by the time you get to Theodosius in 380, which is not so long after Julian's time, in 380, Theodosius puts out this edict of Thessalonica, and according to this edict, Nicene Christianity becomes the state religion of Rome. And so this completely pushes aside the policies of Julian with regard to recognizing a wide array of religious beliefs and practices. By the time of Theodosius, Nicene Christianity is the official thing. It's the only one that has recognition. And that means that any Christians that disagreed with the official Nicene Creed were in trouble. It means that Jews were in trouble. And it means that pagans were in trouble. It's during that period, from Theodosius onward, that it's a very, very difficult stretch in terms of Jewish history within the Byzantine Empire. And this is why, for example, the Jerusalem Talmud is far less organized than the Babylonian, because the Babylonian Talmud was done in Persia, where the policies were generally quite favorable to the Jewish community, and things could be done in a relaxed way, and thinking it out, and well edited, whereas the Jerusalem Talmud, they didn't really have the opportunity to do proper editing, and that makes the text a lot harder to read, because you're not sure sometimes about misspellings, stuff got moved around, and you see descriptions in the Jerusalem Talmud of the kinds of difficulties faced by Jewish communities in the Galilee, for example, after the time of Theodosius. You have this in other Jewish chronicles as well from that period. So yeah, basically after Julian, it all kind of vanishes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. It does. Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Right. Right. So that's actually a very interesting parallel, right? Because we have this example of one pharaoh with a very different perspective than the ones before him and after him. And that pharaoh did not do away with the other gods. He just said, this god is central, and these other ones are peripheral. And, you know, if you factor out the cultural differences between Egypt and Greek thought, and you factor out the differences in time, social factors, there's a great deal of parallel between rulers, yes. And the way that the moment that this ruler with Egypt was born, they go about erasing what he did. And in Egypt, that also meant rubbing out his name from monuments. Now, you know that in Jewish tradition, one of the harshest things one can say is may his name be blotted out, may his name be rubbed out. And that's actually something that we had in common with ancient Egypt, because pharaohs wanted to be remembered. And if their names were rubbed out on the monuments, who's going to remember that they were there? Who's going to remember who they were? And so they literally rubbed his name out of many monuments. And if not for the fact that certain things survived, we might not have even known his name. Yes? Okay. All right. Yeah, okay. Yes. Yes. Well, let me think about that. You see, I tend to go for primary sources. Okay. Okay. All right. All right. Fair enough. Now, one thing I can recommend. There's a very nice set of books that takes the original Greek and Latin texts of various classic writers and has a parallel English translation for each page of Greek. And you can find a collection of Julian's writings in that format, and the set is known as Loeb, L-O-E-B. So if you do a search online for Loeb and then Emperor Julian, it'll probably link you at least with where you can find these texts. Some of them, because they're long out of print, they might even be available in like a PDF format. Other ones, there should be a way of ordering them somewhere. Or obviously, you go to a well-stocked library, you go to the classics section, they'll probably have a long shelf of the Loeb edition. They tended to put them out in these small volumes with either green or red covers. The tendency is that the green covers are in Greek and the Latin ones are in red. Yeah. Right. So if you look through the list of Loeb books, you'll find some that have Julian's writings. They're offhand, I don't recall if it was 4 volumes, 5, 6. There are several volumes that they collected in the Loeb set of Julian's writings. And they're really good in that set about even including things which are fragmentary. You know, just because the thing doesn't exist in its entirety doesn't mean that they toss it out. They'll have it in there. Yeah. Maybe. Yeah. It's fascinating. The beard, yes, Misa Pogon. Absolutely. Right? Not too many emperors that were pro-beard, so that gives him a lot of points in my book. Yes. Yeah. That's a pretty good idea. Yes. Well, I would say that for one thing, if the common perception of paganism is that it is completely antithetical to monotheistic systems of belief, well, Julian's a nice counterexample. And not simply a Greek philosopher, but someone who had very significant political power and was able to put into effect all sorts of policies. And so you see from his actions that there is the possibility of common ground of some sort on some higher level of thought within discussion of the divine in a pagan context and in the monotheistic one. And I think that's a very significant thing, which is not often looked into. And that's something that I think would be a good idea to look into further. You can find elements of this within certain aspects of Egyptian thought, and you can find things that point to it in some other systems in different parts of the world. And so it's worth having a look and seeing, one by one, what exactly are the possibilities of that common ground. Because when people speak of interfaith relations, very often it's about monotheistic to monotheistic, and also very often with some sort of shared text, in part or in full, or whatever. But when you're talking about one system which asserts one God, and another system which has a certain multiplicity, but at the same time, on some level, acknowledges unity, it's worth seeing where that goes. What sort of possibilities are there for discussion about that notion of unity within that system as compared with a monotheistic system of unity? I think that's a very significant thing. Okay. Yes. Yeah. I would say it doesn't hurt. It doesn't hurt. Yes. Very good. Very good. Yeah. I've been grappling with that, actually. I've been grappling with that. And my general answer is, why do I need to choose? Usually these things are placed as in opposition. In recent years, I've been looking more deeply into esoteric traditions within various belief systems. And one of the advantages of a mystic is that a mystic is able to look at two seemingly contradictory ideas and hold them both at the same time. And so I look at Aristotle and Plato and say, okay, yes, there do seem to be things here where they're in opposition, yet maybe not. Maybe on some deeper level, there are interconnections between them that are not immediately noticeable with this basic opposition that is generally described. And if it sounds like I've been influenced by Taoism, yeah, I have been. The interfaith connections that I've made have included Confucian, Taoist, Shintoist directions as well. So, yeah, when I have lengthy dialogue with people in these directions, it does give me some interesting ideas to consider and reconsider other things as well. Wait, okay. You've asked me. I'll get back to you. Yes, new question. Yes? Yeah, okay, so this is where we can play a lot with terminology. That's an interesting phrase you have. Sometimes there's reference to monism, which sort of doesn't specify exactly in what way it's one. I've seen the term henotheism used as well, which refers to a system where you're focusing on one but not necessarily excluding others. Yeah, I think there's more to examine there. Yes, what was your follow-up? I can define it. Well, in a Roman context, the simplest way of describing it is a system which, from the local traditions, and tended to acknowledge a multitude of divinities. that's in a very general sense without getting into details. And I don't want to go more specific because each system has its own particularities. I hope that helps somewhat. Yes? Yeah. Yes. Not quite sure how to analyze that. That's a very good question. In terms of his writings, from what I've seen, it does resonate that a lot of it has to do with his personal beliefs. I mean, when he writes about his thoughts on Christianity, his book is titled "Against the Galileans." Okay, that tells you something. That's the title of his book on Christianity, "Against the Galileans." Okay. So yeah, I think that his personal views had a lot to do with it. Now, to what extent did his switching sides, as it were, help in his political aspirations? Very hard to say, because considering that his predecessors and those who followed him were all into Christianity, would it not then have been easier for him, politically speaking, to go with the flow? So I have a feeling that I would probably give it more weight on the side of his own personal ideas and beliefs, because I don't think it made his life any easier going about it in this way, but he really did believe in what he was doing. Okay? How are we doing? Okay. Let me just add that if anyone here would like to stay in email contact, I'm up for it. Okay, so I got plenty of pages on this thing left, so I have plenty of space for emails. Okay, I'm always looking to widen my range of interactions, and from the questions that I've heard, I think that there could be some very interesting follow-up conversations. Okay, well, I guess that we'll conclude it then. Yes. Any thanks?